Hi everyone, my name is Elaheh. I'm a PhD student at Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto. Today I'm here to present a topic on operational perspective on microfinancing in developing countries. This is a joint work with Professor Barron and Professor Romero. So as you may know, in 2015, 10% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, and that means having income of less than $2 per day. And the World Bank objective was to eliminate poverty by 2030. But because of the COVID crisis in the past year, the poverty rate increased. So it is important to help the poor come out of the poverty trap by giving them access to microfinances to run or expand their businesses in a sustainable way. And this sustainable is important because we want to bring them out of poverty in long run. The effects of reducing poverty can be in improving education, improving healthcare, and more importantly, empowering women in those discriminated areas. Also, poverty is the top sustainable development goal of United Nations, and all in all, these together show the importance of researching in this area. So in this paper, we consider two microfinancing structures and aim at comparing them. The first structure acts as a normal bank. We name it social bank, which operates externally. And like a normal bank, we know people come there and request for loans, and should pay back at the end of the period according to the interest rate. Because this bank is external and doesn't have enforcement power on the borrowers, we assume it acts under limited liability. And that means in case the borrower gets bankrupt, the bank may not get paid back all the amount it was expecting. While on the other hand, there is the community-based bank, which is a new setup in practice. This type of bank acts internally, in which people in one community and one neighborhood gather together and put their money in a safe box. And from that safe box, the people in need borrow money and then pay back at the end of the period according to the agreed upon interest rate. Since people in one community have social ties, they can have enforcement power on each other, and therefore we assume this type of bank operates under unlimited liability, so that the borrowers feel obligated to pay back all the loan at the end of the period. So our research question is, first of all, how does this community-based microfinancing affect the optimal quantity and effort decision of the borrower? Secondly, is it always more beneficial to the society to have the community-based microfinancing, as we intuitively think that is because of the enforcement power? And if it's not always, under what conditions can we say that community-based microfinancing generates higher profits and greater social wealth? So if we want to categorize the literature, we can talk about three relevant streams. First stream is in the OM area, which is a joint analysis of production and financial decisions. I will go through more detail in the next slide. For the second stream, it's about development economics, which they consider competition between microfinancial institutions, or they derive a stylized model for finding the effect of microfinancing on poverty. And also the Nobel laureate Banerjee has a lot of work in this area. The third stream is empirical and case study, which by analyzing the data, they find the efficiency of microfinancial institutions, and also whether it has an effect on poverty or a woman, and so on. So for the joint analysis of production and finance, I will go through more details about the papers in this area. There are some aspects that each of the papers consider. So the first aspect is the some papers consider competitively priced loans. And this means that the banks get zero profit, such as Burgeon Shue, Covalis and Joe, Baron et al. While on the other side, the other papers consider profit maximizing banks, such as Budakut and Zhang, Dada and Hu. Because we want our study to be comprehensive, we consider both these objectives in our work. The main differentiation between our paper and the existing literature is that to my knowledge, the existing literature all study the models under limited liability, and that is because they are about financing the retailer in a supply chain. And because it acts in the developed market, it is under limited liability. While our goal of this paper is to compare the community-based setup, which acts under unlimited liability. Therefore, we consider both these setups. Also, we have bankruptcy costs in our model, which is commonly used in the literature, such as Burgeon Jewel and Covalis and Joe. We consider a model with Newsvendor model with quantity and effort because we want to see the effect of effort on the optimal equilibrium. While the papers in the literature consider Newsvendor model with quantity, which by setting the effort equal to 1, we can get that as well. For the sake of tractability, we assume a single period model, and that is the common assumption in the literature, except for Trikakis, which assume a 2-period model. Also, from the perspective of methodology, we use the Newsvendor model with quantity and effort, which is initiated by Taylor in 2002. So let's go through the model. First, the parameters are similar to the parameters of the original Newsvendor model, which is the price, the cost, and the salvage value. We assume the cost of financing to be R as the interest rate of the loan. We also consider 1 minus alpha to be the sales bankruptcy cost. That means when a Newsvendor is bankrupt, the bank can only get back alpha part of the payments. And 1 minus alpha part of it is lost due to paperwork or getting money from the poor takes time, takes more effort, and so on. This is a common assumption in the literature I explained. And this is independent of being under unlimited liability or limited liability. We have D as the uncertain demand with a CDFFD. U is the Newsvendor's utility. Pi is the bank's profit. SW is the social welfare, which is a summation of the Newsvendor's utility and the bank's profit. Finally, we have a cost of effort denoted as V. So we assume the Newsvendor is risk neutral and decides about quantity, effort, and loan. Without loss of generality, we assume starting budget of the Newsvendor to be 0. Therefore, the loan decision is exactly equal to the production cost. As commonly done in the literature, we assume cost of effort to be strictly convex and increasing in effort. Finally, we have this relation between the parameters, which the first one tries to incentivize the Newsvendor to produce, and the second one is to make the uncertainty play a role and just eliminate the case where production is infinity. So the sequence of events. First, the bank sets the interest rate, which has an upper bound according to the previous assumption. Then the Newsvendor comes and borrows, sets the quantity, sets its effort, and borrows according to that. Then the demand for the Newsvendor product is realized. In the next step, according to the realized demand and whether the Newsvendor is under limited or unlimited liability, the loan paybacks are made. Then at the end, the Newsvendor has some cash on hand left over, which that's why he's happy. And also the bank too, because as I emphasized, we want this process to be sustainable. So we don't want the bank to leave with negative profit. So for the formulation, it depends on whether the Newsvendor is under community-based setup or social bank setup. So when a news vendor is under unlimited liability, the expected utility of the news vendor is same as the original news vendor problem. Just the difference is that we have a minus RCQ in both the first two terms, which that is because of the cost of borrowing loan. And we have minus VE, which is the cost of effort. While when the news vendor is under limited liability, the bankruptcy threshold comes into play, which this threshold means that if demand is lower than this threshold, the profit of the news vendor is negative, and if demand is higher than this threshold, the profit of the news vendor is positive. And because the news vendor is under limited liability, the profit of the former would be 0 at the end. And the next two terms are similar to 1. For formulating the community-based bank, if there is no bankruptcy cost, then because the community-based bank acts under unlimited liability, it can gain all the interest rates it was assuming to gain. While if we add the bankruptcy cost, something positive is reduced from that. For the social bank, the first two terms are similar to 3, but we have an additional negative term, and that is because of the effect of limited liability, because it exists even if we set the bankruptcy cost equal to 0. And that is because the social bank is under more risk, under limited liability, and in some cases, it cannot get some part of the payment back. So we solve this sequential game through backward induction. First, we solve for the news vendor's optimal strategy. Under unlimited liability, we show that there exists unique optimal interest rate and optimal effort that can be derived by solving these two equations simultaneously. If we replace these two equations into expected utility of the news vendor, we see that the expected optimal utility of the news vendor is increasing in effort. And we also see that if we increase the interest rate, the optimal quantity will decrease, as well as the optimal effort and also the optimal ratio of quantity over effort. This last one means that quantity is more sensitive to interest rate compared to effort. For the social bank setup, we need an additional assumption, which is the demand has increasing failure rate. This assumption is common in the paper I introduced, and it is not restrictive because it covers a lot of different distributions, such as uniform, exponential, half normal, Weibull, and so on. So for IFR demand distributions, we show that the unique optimal quantity and effort exists that satisfies these two equations simultaneously. If we replace these two equations into the expected utility of the news vendor, we again see that the expected optimal utility of the news vendor is increasing in optimal effort under limited liability as well. So this result, with the result of the previous slide together, shows us that in order to compare the expected optimal utility of the news vendors under two setups, it is sufficient to only compare the optimal effort levels under the two setups. And we will leverage this result and use it in the next part of the paper. Also, we show that as we increase the interest rate, the optimal quantity, optimal effort, and optimal ratio of the quantity over effort of the news vendor will decrease. So for now, let's go through the important results. First of all, these results depend on the objective of the bank. We assume two different objectives. The first one is a zero profit bank, which means that the banks act in a competitively priced market. Let R0UL be the minimum interest rate that sets the profit of the community bank equal to 0. And we have the same for social bank denoted by R0LL. First, we show that R0UL is smaller or equal to R0LL. That is intuitive because community bank is under less risk and needs to charge a lower value of interest rate to get that zero profit. The next result is interesting. It says that when bankruptcy cost is zero, the optimal efforts of the news vendor under a zero profit community bank is higher than the optimal effort of the news vendor under zero profit social bank. And because banks have zero profit, this is equivalent to expected social welfare being higher under zero profit community bank setup when bankruptcy cost is negligible. And the reason for that is that when bankruptcy cost is zero, the zero profit interest rate set by the community bank is exactly zero. And that brings a huge advantage to the news vendor and incentivize him to put a larger value of effort. But what if we change the bankruptcy cost? Numerically, we have seen the result doesn't hold. For example, for alpha equal to 0.5, if you assume demand follows uniform distribution, cost of effort is of form e to the power of 2, price is 30, C is 10, and S is 5, we see that the optimal effort under limited liability is higher than optimal effort under unlimited liability, which is the reverse result of the previous theory. Therefore, it doesn't hold for other values of alpha. Now, we assume the other objective for the bank, which is profit maximizing bank. And here the bank acts as a monopolist and wants to extract as much profit as it could. For the sake of tractability, we assume demand follows uniform distribution and the cost of effort to be of form eta e to the power of 2 over 2. This is because it helps us find a closed form solution of the news vendor. Then in this case, when bankruptcy cost is zero, we show that the optimal effort under profit maximizing community bank is higher than the optimal effort under profit maximizing social bank. In addition, when the product critical factor is sufficiently low, we show that the expected optimal profit of the community bank is higher than the expected optimal profit of the social bank. And therefore, these two together show that the expected social welfare for the profit maximizing community bank is higher when bankruptcy cost is negligible and product critical factor is sufficient. Intuitively, this is because when product critical factor is low, the news vendor is under high risk, and the probability of bankruptcy of the news vendor is high. And because the news vendor is under limited liability, this risk will transfer to the social bank. And therefore, the social bank needs to set a very high interest rate to cover this risk. And in that case, the news vendor will reduce its quantity and as a result will reduce its effort. We also tried for different IFR demand distributions and verified that this result is robust to different distributions numerically. But here, if we again change the bankruptcy cost, the result of this theorem doesn't hold. For example, here you see two tables. The left-hand side table is the optimal decisions of the news vendor under unlimited liability, and the right-hand side is the optimal decisions under limited liability. And we see when alpha is equal to 0.25, for prices greater than 30, in the right-hand side, we see effort under limited liability is higher than effort under unlimited liability. And that is the reverse of the result we had in theorem 2. So it doesn't hold. So in summary, we consider one period news vendor model with quantity and effort. We find the equilibrium of the news vendor and the bank problem. And we show that it's not necessarily true that community-based microfinancing is always more beneficial than the traditional methods. And we show when bankruptcy cost is negligible, we can claim that the zero-profit community bank microfinancing generates higher social welfare, while the for-profit community bank will generate higher social welfare if product critical factor is sufficiently low. And that is because in that case, the social bank will be under very high risk and will set a very high interest rate. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for listening. I would be happy to take any questions.